So, is in-person therapy superior to self-help? Or is self-help superior to in-person therapy? It depends. I hope to reveal the truth to you in this video. So stay tuned whilst I'm going to try and do that. First, it depends on what in-person therapy you're getting, the quality you're getting, the therapist training. All that stuff obviously depends on the person who's actually giving the therapy. For instance, if you're going to get therapy at a psychologist but you're an OCD case, you're going to get a worst state therapy. Your therapist aren't really going to know much about OCD, head or tail of it, and you're going to sacrifice time and money for something that could have been competitively advantaged otherwise. However, I want to dispute a specific caveat to this condition. First is that I don't believe in the notion that in-person therapy is bad or good. I believe that it's scalable. Now let's talk about self-help. Just as with in-person therapy, self-help also is scalable depending on the type of self-help you're getting, depending on the text you're getting. Is it a clinician's manual? Is it a therapist guide? Is it just an article online that you're actually following? What type of self-help are you getting? How do you follow the self-help? Are you seriously putting the time into self-help? Because all these things do add up to a T. Now, I want to probably tell you about an interest study whilst I was at university. It was my junior year in university, and I did take a elective. The elective was microeconomics. Many of you who study BCom, economics, business studies, administration, everything know more about microeconomics and economics than I do. Maybe you do, maybe you don't. But this class was quite specific on the candidates who succeeded and failed. Now, what they found is they did a bit of a control study with hundreds of students through many, many years, and they found that there were two types of obvious students. There were the in-person students, that means the students who were going into the classes and actually sitting the lectures. And then there were the extramural students, which I was one of. That's the students who enrolled online. Everything was coursework online. You basically had a textbook, you followed the textbook to a T, you had the study guide, but everything was online in the course manual. The lectures were online, but there's a bit of a disclaimer to this one. You don't get help as much from the teacher or the professor. So we didn't have the perk of going to the professor after class and hassling them in questions and asking for extra help and stuff like that and yada yada yada. So that was the in-person people. The in-person or the intramural students were enrolled in the classes and they could specifically go up to the professor, they could ask for more help. We didn't. Now, what the study revealed was something spectacularly interesting, if I could use that word. It was that the extramural students, given at the end of the year a specific analysis of the control groups, they found that the extramural students did 10 to 15% to 20% better than the internally enrolled students, which is quite of a staggering difference. How that happens, I can't tell you apart from the fact that they found that the extramural students were more motivated, they were more tenacious, they were more determined, they were more conscientious than the in-person students. This to me reveals a cardinal diamond truth when it comes to the argument between self-help and in-person therapy. Oftentimes you find the same thing happening with the distinction that people who are invested in self-help get much more bang for their buck. They get more information, they're more studious, they're really serious about curing themselves. They're not just spilling money onto a gutter of in-person therapy and just trying to shut it another time. And I think this is why self-help, or the advocates thereof, can get so much more in little time. My message is not to dissuade people who are going for in-person therapy, but I think there are a number of problems why in-person therapy can be inferior to self-help. Number one is obviously that in-person therapy has a profiteering margin. For instance, if you're going to go to a therapist, you can understand that that person is going to milk you some way. They want to get money from you. And to them, it's going to be incentivized to, say, stretch the session out for a year before you're going to get better. So if you ask a therapist, how many sessions are you going to take to actually cure me or to get me better, they would usually mumble about, it could take months to a year, but everybody differs, that type of thing. So you don't actually have a specific cordial gesture of how long you should be able to go for therapy until you're going to get better. That's to me a massive issue. For instance, if I'm going to go for training and anything, I want to know after 5, 6 sessions what the average person would take to get better. And I think that's where quantity versus quality gets a bit more deterred. For instance, therapists focus more on quantity of lessons rather than quality after time, and it's more about pumping in more sessions than actually giving quality sessions. I think this is a major problem. Even from credible therapists, you get the same issue. Now, I'm not saying that's every therapist, but I say this is a cardinal issue with therapy, that somebody can potentially profiteer and can actually milk you as much as they want. The second problem, obviously, is what you learn. If I found that my own personal experience, you can actually read in an article, is I've tried to approach therapists who were deemed OCD specialists, and what I found was quite startlingly. I found that the OCD specialists themselves were mostly psychologists. When I asked them about the training, they said that they had a couple of workshops and they worked with many or a bunch of cases like I was, but they couldn't actually specify, they couldn't actually put numbers on any of their claims. And to me, I was immediately suspicious of whether these people know anything about OCD. Now, these people are claimed OCD experts. So, what is an OCD expert and what is not? It's very difficult to tell. Usually, it amounts to a workshop or two and physical in-person clients that the therapist had, but oftentimes they're not, or more times than not, it just amounts to maybe a workshop in OCD, which to me, a workshop alone, say for a workshop the person is OCD specialist or not, isn't it just better to go for a book or a manual, just grab one off the shelf and just flip through it and then just study it? Now, obviously, the two should tell you, if you have the money, if you have the resources to go and see a therapist and you have the time, maybe your OCD isn't as egregious, maybe it isn't as venomizing, then it makes complete sense why you want to get a therapist, why you want to go and approach somebody who is actually a board classified IFCDF specialist. It makes completely sense, especially if you're doing a combination of self-help visits, especially if you've done self-help before and you want to go and find a therapist just to kind of pothole like to kind of put or to put surface over the potholes and to to essentially shave it out. So it makes complete sense if you want to polyfiller or put something over it to cover it somehow. You cover the hole, so to speak. So it makes complete sense, of course. But I don't think that. So it really is I think it's a semantical issue here. I think that when people in general, especially if they're suffering a lot and they have time, it makes sense to try and find a good therapist that you can work with and structure the sessions so that you do a bit per day, per time. Not too much, of course, but if it's a very aggressive thing, of course, you're going to need something faster. Another problem that I found with therapists is they have a structured approach, meaning that that was kind of number one, but the other problem with the structured approach is, of course, that you cannot rush the session. So it's not as if you can say, I've already done it with a therapist before, I've already did the ERP, I've already did the hierarchies before, I want you to just start with session 4 on mindfulness training. It doesn't work like that. Most therapists have their own routine, their own ways of doing things. I'm going to get into the own ways thing because, of course, the own ways, quote unquote, is a problem, and that's something I'm going to get to in as well. But therapists have their own ways, they have their own schedules, meaning that if you start with a new therapist, you're starting from ground zero, and it's not as if you can tell that person, hey, I want to start with ERP, I want to start with CBT, I want to start with the cognitive distortions part. They're going to say, hold on, let me start with the base level first. We haven't even covered this. You have to start emptying your cup before you go to me, and that kind of is the problem with therapists in general. Is they don't begin on a tail end problematic. They don't begin on a sequentiating relationship with your prior therapy work. They start afresh on a new job or a new spec, so you don't get the perk of starting from where you want to start always. Maybe I'm wrong. I don't believe, I don't think I'm wrong because I know exactly from first hand and from second hand and third hand experience how people usually resort to me, the problems with in-person therapy in general. I think that's much to say about therapy. And there's something else that I want to actually talk about. If you have a condition that's not readily treatable and readily known, you're probably not going to find a therapist who have physical experience with that problem. So because OCD actually differs in shape, form, and size, and also smell, and shape, and sight, and objectiveness, and subjectiveness, you're gonna find it very difficult, especially if you have a condition that's extremely scant and extremely diminished in terms of frequency. You're gonna find it very difficult to find a therapist who really understands that. They understand the motive, and the thing of the motif behind your OCD is a very big drive in actually how to get better. I know many people would kind of push back and say, but isn't it supposed to work for everyone with OCD? Isn't Yes and no. Firstly, yes, ERP works, but you can do ERP incorrectly, of course. And there's another thing I'm going to be talking about, including trust. I'm not going to get ahead of myself. Let's just get to the next step. Self-help. Self-help to me is, I think, thanks to the 21st century, we can get our hands on almost anything today. Books, courses, resources, literature, studies. All these things are perks and credible and authentic sources that we can physically and dynamically and digitally approach to get our hands on whatever we really want to. And thanks to the archive, we have so much information. There's literally anything under the wing of self-help. There's good things and there's bad things. It's a sea and an ocean of fish, like depending on how you're going to catch them, right? So the first thing about self-help is everything tentatively self-help isn't the same, even remotely the same. There's so east to west differentiation when it comes to self-help material. For instance, you can go on a site and you can Google OCD specialist advice and you can find specific advice, but the person isn't an OCD specialist, and you can claim that to be self-help. Or you can get credible resources, you can get a credible workbook, and that's self-help as well. So there's no difference between the two. You're still going for self-help despite getting a not so good advice or a better advice. Now, self-help offers a lot more. If you are now, just before I'm going to continue with exactly how I'm going to categorize self-help, I want to say I believe, and from what I've seen, not only can you get very deep with self-help to cure yourself, you can do it much faster than in-person therapy. And also, if you know portals and correct resources and you maximize and capitalize on what you can actually get, you can get to the same, you can get to exactly the same frequency of betterment than you would in in-person therapy, or better. I don't make this case lightly. I'm going to link some studies below on this video that actually supports that self-help people who are interested in self-help and actually conducting self-help therapy can actually sometimes as much as double the rate of success in whatever therapy they are in. This to me is a wow result. Now, I want to tell you, if you want to go through the self-help route, maybe because you don't have access to therapy and maybe because you're just a very serious person, self-help isn't demonized. I believe completely and wholeheartedly and introspectively that self-help can absolutely replace in-person therapy, given that you get the right resources, approach the right people, approach peers who are also struggling and have solved the problem, conquered the problem. I think peers who solved and conquered the problem is just as helpful, if not more helpful, than the therapist, because they know what works firsthand. So they don't just have the authenticity of theoretical knowledge. They know what firsthand have applied their situation to it, and they know firsthand how the tools and what worked. And also, if you actually can galvanize on this, you can find so many more people who struggled, and you can actually just you can physically suck up on that benefit of them. You can actually work and piggyback on their results, which is quite surprising. So I absolutely am a massive buff for self-help. I believe self-help in anything. I mean, you look at school children is essentially, learning from teachers. Are teachers better? Are teachers necessary for a child to learn? No, not necessarily. A child can learn if he or she really wants to learn. They can get the books, they can get the textbooks. I'm not here talking about elementary school or anything. Let's assume they can read and write, and of course they can get themselves a textbook. If they really want to study, they can study. So studying isn't this thing where you need a teacher to. It's harder sometimes if you get the wrong stuff, but today we have all the resources under our noses to actually get the right stuff. That's the thing. We know it's easy to get the right stuff to study. So I just wanted to kind of get it out there that it's not the case that self-help is inferior to in-person therapy. Alas, self-help can be much more maximally beneficial.